everyone! My name is Belen Mella, and this is the January 2018 Public Forum Video Topic Analysis for Champion Briefs. So, the debate topic this month is Resolved, Spain should grant Catalonia its independence. Now, this is a really interesting debate topic, and that's because it's going to require American debaters to become completely immersed in an international issue, to understand the culture, the history, and the current politics of Catalonia, how that fits into the culture, history, and politics of Spain, and actually understand the history of this conflict in order to understand the arguments. So I'll put extra emphasis on that. I think in some debate topics, knowing the history is going to make you sound smarter and cooler in Crossfire. I think in this debate topic, knowing the history is actually crucial to the arguments. Understanding a little bit about the Spanish Civil War, understanding a little bit about what makes Catalan culture different, understanding secessionist movements in other countries and history of those. These are all things that are going to be actually important to the substance of the debate. So start reading because it'll go a long way. Another thing I think is interesting on this topic is that it's going to be good for training your debate muscles, because it really isn't that there's a set of facts and arguments that pertain to one side and a separate set of facts and arguments for another side. It's the same set of facts, and it's a matter of how you frame them. So, to give you an example, a bunch of Catalan former leaders are currently either in jail or awaiting trial or in self-imposed exile, and whether or not you think that's totally unfair and totally repressive, because they were just trying to exercise their democratic right to vote for the potential of independence, or you think it's completely in line because the Spanish constitution says the country is indissoluble, and that to host a referendum to determine whether or not you want to separate from the country is going against the constitution, so it makes sense that they're awaiting trial. However you want to look at that, it is a matter of framing. So it's all about how well you can explain yourself, how persuasive you can be to your judge, how well you're going to warn your arguments. So all in all, a good topic for practicing how to really debate well. So before I go into the history, just for people who are completely new to this topic, understanding what's going on. Catalonia is a small, semi-autonomous region within Spain. You might know it for its capital, Barcelona, and Catalonia has, even though it's part of Spain, it's part of the country and has always been for as long as Spain has been a country in the modern sense of like a nation state. Catalonia does have a distinct culture. They also have a distinct language. They speak Catalan there, not Spanish. So a mix of factors that I'll get into later has led Catalonia to currently be pushing for independence. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's behind independence, but there certainly is a strong and loud enough faction that independence is on the table now, and it's gained sort of international recognition. Not independence itself, but the movement. It's just sort of something people are paying attention to. So this sort of spiked on October 1st when the Catalan government held a referendum. And this referendum was meant to be a vote on whether or not they should become independent, form their own independent country, and separate from Spain. Crucially, the Spanish central government determined that this referendum was illegal, so everybody who was against the movement to become independent was instructed to boycott it. That makes the results difficult to interpret, because even though in the referendum 90% of people voted yes, we want to be independent, there was only a 43% turnout, because the referendum was illegal, and if you didn't support independence, you were encouraged to boycott it. To make matters even more complicated, the Spanish central government did not respond the right way. They sent the police to the polls to try to sort of limit access to the polls, to take ballot boxes, etc., and it ended up being a very violent, very chaotic event where reports showed that approximately 800 people were injured. So that only made the Spanish central government look worse, it makes it even harder to interpret the results of the referendum, and in the aftermath, a couple of things had happened. For one, a lot of these Catalan leaders are either in jail, awaiting trial, or in self-imposed exile. Furthermore, the Spanish central government invoked something called Article 155, which is something they had never invoked before, which let them to completely suspend, temporarily, the autonomy of Catalonia so that they could go in, call for a new election, and sort of take care of things while the government was temporarily suspended. And then since then, on December 21st, the new election took place. And what happened is, again, a little bit difficult to interpret, but for the purposes of debate, really interesting. Even though the party that won the plurality, that means sort of the most votes but not a majority of votes, was a party that was in favor of union, that is, in favor of staying in Spain, the parties that were pro-independence ultimately won the majority in a coalition. So a bunch of smaller independence parties grouped together, and they have the majority in parliament. So there's really interesting things going on right now, and again, it's super debatable, even though it sort of is hard to drive the message all the way home, either pro or con. Okay. So, going back to this history that I promised, you can go way back and try to figure out when sort of the Catalan language became a distinct thing and blah, 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 blah. But I think just an easy place to start is with the Spanish Civil War, which took place between 1936 and 1939. It involved lots of different factions fighting for a multitude of reasons, but one of the reasons, some of the literature will point out, is the question of Catalan independence, or not necessarily independence, but a greater degree of autonomy. So understand why the war broke out, and crucially, understand the outcomes of it. At the end of the war, Spain was then controlled by General Francisco Franco. He was a military dictator that ruled from 1939 until his death in 1975, and he was extremely repressive to the Catalan people. So I'll quote here, he cancelled the autonomy chapters the Republic had granted to the Catalans and the Basques, which is another region. Furthermore, he banned all regional languages and symbols, including the Catalan language, its flag, and its national holiday. So under Franco's rule, the Catalan people didn't have autonomy and they couldn't express their sort of cultural difference. And even though Franco is long gone, the sort of history and the memory of his rule still remains. So it's something that is probably in the back of people's minds when they consider this question of independence. Okay, fast forwarding a little bit to closer to the modern day. In 2006, Catalonia was granted a statute of autonomy. But then in 2010, the government ruled this back. So they canceled this, or they overruled part of the 2006 autonomy statute, stating that there is no legal basis for recognizing Catalonia as a nation within Spain. This angered a lot of people. It's always been a sort of back and forth between pushing for a little bit more autonomy, getting it restricted, pushing for a little bit more, etc., etc. And the people that are pro-Catalan autonomy, and probably not pro-Catalan independence, viewed this as a major blow to their movement. I think another important reason to understand for why the movement for Catalan independence is sort of gaining steam right now is the financial crisis, the global financial crisis that happened in 2007 and 2008. After that happened, Spain's government implemented austerity measures, which means like economic tightening, spending less money and sort of putting some pressure on the economy. Catalonia, which is one of the major economic producers and sort of industrial heartlands of Spain, didn't like this, and its political leaders were able to sort of deflect the anger to the Spanish central government and sort of increase the calls for independence. So for those reasons, and probably many more, the movement for Catalan independence is currently peaking, right? Now, some major players to keep in mind. One is Spain's Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy. He's of the Conservative People's Party. This party is anti-Catalan independence, and they're only the 5th largest party in Catalonia. That's important to understand. If the leader of the country only has the 5th largest party in your region, you probably don't feel like the central government is sort of representative of your region and of your region's interests. And indeed, probably especially after the way that the Spanish government handled the referendum on October 1st, the Catalan people are not happy with this prime minister. Another important person to understand here is Puigdemont. He was the leader of Catalonia, and he, as of when this video was filmed, was in self-imposed exile in Brussels, and is clamoring to be allowed to rule Catalonia again, but the Spanish central government won't let him. So, the central government in Madrid declared the referendum that the Catalans wanted to have illegal, and that's because Spain's democratic constitution, which was signed in 1978, and Kantians might point out was approved by more than 90% of Catalan voters, quote, gave wide autonomy to the regions, but affirmed the indissoluble unity of the Spanish nation. In layman's terms, that just means we're a country, we can't fracture off and stop being a country. So even though there are legal paths to gaining more autonomy, and there might even be legal paths toward independence somehow, just holding a referendum and trying to break off by yourself and trying to secede by yourself, that's going to be illegal. So, something that I think we need to understand when we're just framing this topic. One important thing is that in the literature, that means when you Google this, when you find maybe scholarly articles or news articles or whatever, you're going to find that the Spanish government is not down. They don't want Catalonia to be independent, right? But in the world of the resolution, the prose says, like, yes, we affirm, Spain should grant Catalonia its independence. So there's going to be a lot of arguments that don't make sense in the pro world when you sort of try to reconcile them with the literature, so you have to sort of expand your imagination a little bit beyond the literature. I'm going to try to give you an example in case this is confusing. One big issue that I'll talk about later when it comes to the economy is whether Catalonia as an independent nation would be allowed to join the European Union. The current literature will tell you Spain would never approve that. there's no way that Spain's going to let them join, because they don't want them to be independent. In the pro-world, it's up to you to interpret whether or not this means that Spain is okay with Catalan independence, since in the pro-world they're granting it. And so maybe in the pro-world, even though the literature says they'd never let them in the EU, Spain actually might. That isn't to say to ignore the literature, it's just to say, keep in mind that the literature doesn't acknowledge the pro-alternative in which Spain would sort of grant it willingly. Okay. Another thing when we're thinking about framing is that the resolution is sort of written from the perspective of Spain, right? So we often talk about actors in the resolution. That means sort of the subject that's making things happen. In this resolution, the actor is Spain. Spain should grant Catalonia its independence. So teams can choose to frame it as, is this in Spain's interest? If it's not, negate, because Spain is the actor. But this can definitely be pushed back on. After all, the resolution does say should, and should, as we know, is used to indicate obligation, duty, or correctness, typically when criticizing someone's actions. So everything is debatable from the perspective of framing. These are just things to keep in mind. So let's start on the arguments. And the first place to start here is, what do the people want? Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's a little bit hard to determine exactly what the people want. I mean, there's polls, there's electoral outcomes, there's visible protests on the streets, both in favor of union and in favor of independence, so it's a little bit hard to determine, okay, how many Catalonians want what? I'm going to base myself off of the most recent numbers that I heard, but I recommend that anybody, before a debate round, look up the most recent numbers, and just generally the most recent lay of the land, so that you have up-to-date information. So, based on the figures I understand, when it's presented as a binary option, that means two options, either preserve the status quo or become an independent country, something like 55% of Catalonians wanted to preserve the status quo, and something like 45% wanted to become an independent country. So still not a majority, although there are polls that disprove that and that show a majority wanting to be independent. I mean, notably the referendum, which shows 90% of Catalonians wanting to be independent. Now, when it's more than a binary option, when the options are status quo, full-on independence, or some degree of autonomy, like a little bit more autonomy than we currently have, the numbers change. And it becomes only in the 20% of people who want to be independent, and something like 71% who want either the status quo or some more degree of autonomy, or just generally some change. So whether or not it's a binary option is really interesting and will show you a different result as to what the people want. I also think polls always are flawed, and it's worthwhile to compare it to electoral outcomes. So for the past few years, the Catalan parliament has been ruled by a majority of pro-independence parties, and as of the December 21st election, that's still the case. It's pro-independence parties that have been elected to office. Now, smart debaters are going to look into how the electoral process works, and whether the way that regions and districts of voting are set up is going to sort of distort the electoral outcome so that it actually doesn't reflect sort of the popular vote. Maybe pro-independence party has always been a majority, but that doesn't mean that they have actually the majority support when it comes to just individual people voting. I think it's also important to note that just because a majority wants it or a majority doesn't want it, that doesn't have to be the end-all be-all of the debate. I mean, if there's a strong, compelling case for the oppression of maybe a minority of people, or if only a minority of people feel the full extent of the oppression, and slightly larger percentage just don't care as much, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be independent. So take everything with a grain of salt, and take everything really, really analytically, because this is a complicated topic. So I've hinted at this a little bit, but let's dig into it now. What is this argument about oppression? During the Franco regime, you could certainly say the Catalan people were oppressed. I mean, they couldn't use their own language. People who had Catalan names, like literally Catalan first names, had to change them. So that was extremely problematic. As to how the situation is today, it depends on who you ask. And I mean, you certainly want to respect people's opinions and how they regard that they are or aren't being oppressed, but I mean, some things to understand so that you could use them for your arguments. On the one hand, Catalonia does enjoy quite a bit of autonomy. They control their own police force, their own education department, their own health department. Kids do learn Catalan in schools, and in some schools only teach Spanish 3 hours a week. Street signs are in Catalan. I mean, there is tremendous autonomy, and Spain is a democratic country. There's different indices that you could look up for how democratic a country is that'll rank them numerically, and it's doing pretty well. I mean, then on the other hand, look at what happened on the October 1st referendum. The military, or not the military, but the police took to the streets and hurt people that were just trying to cast the ballot. The leaders have been since jailed. Even before the referendum took place, their freedom of speech laws aren't the best, and there's sort of gag laws that leaders were jailed even just for speaking out in favor of independence. Beyond that, I believe that even though they speak Catalan, it can't formally be the #1 language because the Spanish language has to be above it. And I mean, tons of other little details like that. I know, for example, Catalonia tried to make the running of the bulls illegal, and the Spanish government ruled that back and said, you can't make that illegal, it's integral to Spanish identity. So whether or not you want to say that that constitutes oppression, maybe it doesn't to the fullest extent, but are there plenty of examples that you could string together in a compelling narrative as to why the Catalan people, because of their distinct culture, their distinct history, their distinct language, deserve to rule themselves, and why the Spanish government isn't exactly being super democratic and super sort of responsive to their needs? Yes, that argument can certainly be made. So look into those arguments, and they're extremely compelling. After all, some teams will find it hard to weigh. Like, some teams will call oppression a nebulous, sort of intangible argument, and it doesn't have like a hard number of lives attached to it, but at the end of the day, it can be the most powerful argument when you're talking about the oppression of people, not letting people express their culture, express their language, express their identity, when you're talking about people getting beaten on the streets. I mean, with the right framing, with the right rhetoric, it becomes an extremely powerful argument. Okay. I'm going to shift gears here and talk about the economy. So there's lots of points on the economy. One pertains to the economy of Spain, and another pertains to the economy of Catalonia. As for the Spanish economy, if Catalonia were to secede and become independent, it would probably be a pretty big blow to the Spanish economy. That's because Catalonia accounts for 20% of the Spanish GDP. It's a major center of tourism, it's a major center of industry, and it's a major center of imports and exports. Barcelona is one of the biggest ports. I mean, generally Catalonia is a hub of the Spanish economy. So if they were to lose that overnight, that wouldn't bode well for them. Of course, there's responses to this argument. A common one is that the Spanish economy in the long term will be better off because they're able to diversify and invest on their own sort of industrial deepening. Without Catalonia, there's arguments that they'll still be able to trade with Catalonia, and that you won't feel many of these impacts, but on the whole, there is a compelling case to be made that Spain's economy would suffer. Shifting gears a little bit to the Catalan economy, it's important to understand that a lot of the grievances have to do with the economy, have to do with the fact that Catalonia feels as though it produces more than it receives. After all, they pay more in taxes to the Spanish government than they receive in benefits. So you could frame this both ways. You could frame it either as an injustice to Catalonia if you make them keep paying more than they get back, or as something that makes sense because richer regions oftentimes pay out more than they receive in benefits because that distribution of wealth a little bit is necessary for the poorer regions in Spain to keep afloat. Now, understanding the economy point from Catalonia's perspective a little bit more, something that gets really complicated is that even though they do have all this industry, do have all this tourism, and could hope to preserve it in the event of them seceding, there's a few issues to keep in mind. So one is the question of instability. Already, just with the referendum and the protests on the street, tons of businesses have moved their headquarters out of Catalonia and into mainland Spain because they don't like the uncertainty that comes with this question of independence. Now, is this debatable? For sure. Is this a long-term problem? Probably not, because any instability will quell in the long term once people understand, okay, this is a new country, it's a stable new country. An issue that might be harder to get around is membership in the EU. Catalonia obviously does a bunch of its trades within Spain and a whole bunch of its trades within the European Union. So it becomes a really important question whether or not they'd be able to join the EU after becoming independent. Now, something to keep in mind is even the best case scenario where they could join the EU with no problem, it's still a really long time period. I think it's like maybe a decade-long waiting period between all the sort of processes of becoming a member state. But even before you get to that point, though, there's plenty of roadblocks. One main roadblock is that in order to become a member, it needs to be a unanimous decision. According to the literature, Spain would certainly block it, but as I warned you, maybe this would be different in the pro-world if Spain were to willingly grant them independence. Not necessarily though. Spain could grant them independence and not be all too happy about it. Even if Spain isn't the problem though, there's other countries that are likely to be a problem, and that's because many countries in Europe have their own separatist factions. So there's Flanders in Belgium, there's Corsica in France, there's plenty of regions in Italy, and as we know, the Scottish issue in the UK. So there's plenty of regions that are trying to do something similar to what Catalonia is doing, and if membership in the EU has to be a unanimous decision, and these countries, France, Italy, the UK, Belgium, etc., just gave Catalonia the go-ahead to join the EU, it might spark their own separatist movements and give them sort of a signal that if they were to become independent, they could also easily join the EU. So there's plenty of reasons why Catalonia might not be let in, and it's up to teams to really dive that all the way home as to why that would be catastrophic for their economy. Now, as I've already hinted throughout this, there are plenty of responses to that. They might actually be let in if you get around the sort of argument about the separatist regions, and the argument about Spain because the literature doesn't reflect the current reality, etc., etc. Furthermore, even absent the EU, they could probably still reasonably trade with these countries by just setting up tariff agreements with the countries individually, not part of the economic union, but still sort of something that's financially beneficial. Because in the same way that Catalonia trades a lot with the EU trades a lot with Catalonia. In fact, if it were its own independent country, it would be the 15th wealthiest in the European Union. So countries stand to benefit a lot by continuing to trade with the region. Okay. Gonna shift your gears again and talk about these other movements that I keep on hinting at. So I already mentioned these other movements. If you want to run this, maybe look at specific examples as to movements that are on the brink of becoming an independent nation or on the brink of their own referendum, and that could really be like stoked and inspired by what's happening in Catalonia. It's up to teams to sort of create the rhetoric of how much it's an inspiration and a sort of go ahead if Catalonia were to be independent. Other teams are obviously going to push back on this and say, look, plenty of countries have succeeded and failed in independence movements. If your country wants to be independent, it's not going to be deterred or inspired by an independence movement happening in another country. So, I mean, it's hard to determine truly how strong this link is, but are there plenty of politicians and political scientists out there that say that it would sort of spark more fracturing within Europe? Yes, there are. So it's an interesting argument to run. A specific example to look into is the Basques. So the Basques are part of another region in Spain that have also had their own sort of tug of war for autonomy over the years. Now, if you look at today, they've gone out on the street and interviewed Basque people and conducted polls to figure out how the Catalan issue of this new Catalonian independence movement is affecting their perspective. A lot of them seem to be relatively content with the autonomy agreement that they have with Spain. And that's because their agreement is a little bit stronger than the one Catalonia had with Spain. They get a little bit more fiscal autonomy and they get a little bit more control of their own affairs. So it seems to be that they're satisfied, but that hasn't always been the case. In fact, historically, the Basque movement for independence has been way more violent than the Catalan movement for independence. And for a long period of time, they had a terrorist group that would conduct atrocities in Spain for the sake of independence. So if teams can find arguments about separatist movements in general, or even separatist movements specific to Spain, like the Basques, that would be inspired or incentivized by Catalan independence, that's a pretty interesting argument. Okay, another argument that is more about a framing perspective is this idea that the fight for independence is this sort of long-term push that isn't going to go away anytime soon. So the way this argument goes is to say, look, the Catalonians have been fighting for independence for a really long time, right? The Spanish Civil War was somehow related to it. In 2006, they fought for this autonomy statue. In 2010, it was taken away, etc., etc. So this fight is going to keep on going, and this argument is basically to say we could do this the easy way, vote pro, grant them independence, or we could do it the hard way, risk sort of more tensions, more economic issues because of this instability, and maybe even some violence if we see the resurgence of terrorist groups that in the past have fought for independence, or sort of wars backed by different parties break out. I mean, there's plenty of reasons why drawing out this conflict and giving them a not sustainable, not long-term solution would create problems. And it is a relatively compelling, if not contention to vote pro, then just like a framing mechanism to vote pro. It's also important to look into the news. So this is a very news-heavy topic in addition to just scholarly literature-heavy. And as of recently, Rajoy's government said they're willing to compromise and they're willing to at least open talks for more autonomy. So remember back when I said if it's presented as a binary option of independence or status quo, lots of people want independence, but if it's presented as a binary of independence, status quo, or more degree of autonomy, way, way, way less people want independence. Something to keep in mind. If Rajoy's government is open to compromise, it's open to some sort of dialogue, then maybe that means that we can settle for a better middle ground that doesn't require delving into the pro and getting into all of the harms of the pro, that we can strike some sort of middle ground, happy balance, and stay within the territory of the con. Now, it's one thing that Rajoy's government is open to conversations, it's another argument entirely to suggest that they're actually going to go forward with them, and that anything will come of them. Okay. There's other arguments that start getting on the little less mainstream side, and I want to encourage you guys to do that research, but I mean, some things to think about are the issue of terrorism. Catalonia has historically had a little bit more international terrorism than the rest of Spain. Would they be able to deal with this if they were an independent country? It's a good question to ask. There's the issue of accepting refugees. Catalonia has historically been more interested in accepting refugees than the rest of Spain has been, so maybe as an independent country they'd be able to do this, and that'd be great for addressing the refugee crisis, or maybe be bad because they wouldn't be able to handle it as an independent country without the sort of resources and intelligence teams and whatever else that the Spain's government that has existed for far longer wouldn't be able to provide them with. So I've been talking a mile a minute, but hopefully this is a great sort of first step for you guys to start your research. Stay up to date on the news, understand the history, and practice the persuasion, because this is a topic that's all about how you frame it. It's not just clear-cut one way or the other. So good luck, happy holidays, happy new year. Take this time to prep or rest, both are good, and I hope that you have a great month of debating.